name is Emily Rodriguez. I'm 28 years old, and 6 months ago, I watched my stepbrother Tyler sell my late father's most precious possession to fund his failing app startup. That watch wasn't just worth $85,000, it was my father's symbol of making it in America. Today, Tyler's business has collapsed, he's facing bankruptcy, and the watch sits in my safe at home. But before I tell you how I got it back and destroyed everyone who betrayed me, let me ask you something important. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My father, Miguel Rodriguez, came to Denver with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that hard work could build anything. He started Rodriguez Construction in 1987 with a borrowed pickup truck and a toolbox that had seen better days. I still remember him coming home covered in dust and concrete, his work boots leaving trails across our small apartment floor, but his eyes always lit up when he saw me waiting by the window. Dad would sit me on his lap and show me blueprints, tracing his finger along the lines while explaining how foundations needed to be perfect, because everything else depended on them. Mija, he'd say in his thick accent, in construction, you build from the ground up. In life, you do the same. Never forget where you started, but never stop reaching higher. By the time I turned 10, Rodriguez Construction had grown into something remarkable. Dad specialized in affordable housing developments, building communities where working families could actually afford to live. He understood what it meant to struggle for a decent home, because he'd lived in that struggle. Every project he completed was personal. Every family that moved into one of his developments was a victory against the poverty he'd left behind in Guadalajara. The day he bought that Rolex Submariner, I was 15. We'd just finished touring his biggest project yet, a 200-unit affordable housing complex that would house over 500 families. Dad had been wearing the same digital Casio for 20 years, checking it obsessively during every meeting, every inspection, every moment that mattered in building his empire. This watch, he said, holding the gleaming Rolex in the jewelry store, this represents every morning I woke up at 4 a.m., every rejection from banks who thought a Mexican immigrant couldn't be trusted with a loan, every night I fell asleep planning the next day's work. The salesperson looked uncomfortable as Dad spoke, probably wondering if this construction worker could actually afford an $85,000 timepiece. Dad paid in cash. He always paid in cash. That watch became part of him. He wore it to every groundbreaking ceremony, every city council meeting where developers tried to block his affordable housing projects, every celebration when another family got their keys. When I graduated from University of Colorado Boulder, with degrees in business and urban planning, he was checking that watch in the front row, making sure he didn't miss a single moment of my speech as valedictorian. Time is the only thing we can't build more of, he'd tell me during our Sunday morning walks through his developments. That's why this watch matters. It reminds me that every minute I spend building something good is a minute that changes someone's life. Dad taught me everything about the construction business, but more importantly, he taught me about building things that lasted. Not just buildings, but relationships, reputations, and legacies that could withstand any storm. He showed me the books, introduced me to the suppliers, walked me through every aspect of running a multi-million-dollar construction company. What he never told me was that he'd been quietly setting up something much bigger, something that would protect everything he'd built, and ensure that his mission of providing affordable housing would continue long after he was gone. Something that Linda and Tyler would never see coming, because they were too busy planning how to spend his money to notice what he was actually building for me. That watch was just the beginning of what they thought they could take. They had no idea what they were really up against. When I was 16, everything changed. Dad met Linda Thompson at a charity auction for children's literacy programs. She was elegant, well-spoken, and worked as a marketing coordinator for a prominent Denver law firm. Linda had this way of making everyone in the room feel like they were the most interesting person she'd ever met. She laughed at Dad's stories about construction mishaps, asked thoughtful questions about his housing projects, and seemed genuinely impressed by his journey from immigrant laborer to successful businessman. What struck me most about Linda was how different she was from the women Dad usually dated. After my mother died when I was 7, Dad had a few relationships, but they were always with women from our community. Women who understood where we came from and appreciated what we'd built together. Linda came from a completely different world. She lived in Cherry Hills Village, drove a pristine white BMW, and had a son named Tyler who was 3 years older than me and already attending Colorado State University on his parents' dime. Tyler was everything I wasn't. Where I spent summers working construction sites and learning about permits and zoning laws, Tyler spent summers at his grandparents' lake house in Aspen. Where I chose my clothes based on practicality and budget, Tyler wore designer brands that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Where I spoke Spanish with Dad at home and helped him practice English pronunciation for important meetings, Tyler complained when restaurants didn't have English-only menus. Linda and Tyler lived in a world where money appeared effortlessly. Tyler's father, Linda's ex-husband, was a petroleum engineer who paid substantial alimony and child support. Linda's family owned several successful businesses across Colorado. They weren't wealthy in the way my father was wealthy. They hadn't built their fortune from nothing, but they had something Dad's money couldn't buy: generational connections, social acceptance, and the quiet confidence that comes from never having to prove you belong. When Dad announced they were getting married after 18 months of dating, I was genuinely happy for him. He deserved companionship, love, and someone who appreciated everything he'd accomplished. Linda seemed to adore him, often telling friends about her brilliant husband who'd built his empire with just his hands and determination. She threw dinner parties where she'd showcase Dad's success stories, introducing him as my husband, the construction mogul who's changing Denver's affordable housing landscape. The wedding was beautiful. Dad insisted on paying for everything, despite Linda's protests that her family could contribute. "This is my celebration," he said firmly. "I want to do this right." He rented the ballroom at the Brown Palace Hotel, hired a mariachi band alongside a traditional wedding band, and made sure every single one of his construction workers and their families were invited. Watching him dance with Linda while wearing his Rolex and his best suit, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched, I thought maybe this blended family thing could actually work. Linda moved into our family home, bringing Tyler with her for holidays and summer breaks from college. Initially, the adjustment felt natural. Linda redecorated parts of the house with tasteful modern touches that somehow honored Dad's Mexican heritage, while adding her own sophisticated flair. She started hosting Sunday dinners, where she'd invite Dad's business associates and their families, creating a warm environment where deals were discussed over homemade tamales and wine. Tyler, for his part, seemed to respect Dad's accomplishments. He'd ask thoughtful questions about construction projects, showed interest in learning about real estate development, and even spent one summer working at Rodriguez Construction doing basic administrative tasks. Dad was pleased, often saying he enjoyed having a son around the house, someone who could eventually help expand the business in new directions. What I didn't recognize at the time was how carefully Linda was studying everything. She attended every business meeting Dad would allow, memorized the names of his key suppliers and subcontractors, and slowly began inserting herself into conversations about company finances and future planning. She encouraged Dad to formalize his business structure, suggesting he create more detailed documentation of his assets and establish clearer succession planning. Linda's suggestions always sounded reasonable, even helpful. She'd witnessed how hard Dad worked and genuinely seemed concerned about protecting everything he'd built. Her background in marketing meant she understood business operations, and her connections in Denver's professional community opened doors that had previously been closed to Dad, despite his wealth and success. But there were subtle moments that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate why at the time. During my senior year at University of Colorado Boulder, I met David Chen at a campus sustainability conference. He was presenting research on green building materials while I was there, representing Rodriguez Construction's new eco-friendly housing initiative. David had this quiet intensity about him that immediately caught my attention. Unlike most guys I'd dated who were either intimidated by my family's wealth or obviously interested in it, David seemed genuinely curious about the technical aspects of sustainable construction. We spent 3 hours after his presentation walking around campus, discussing everything from solar panel efficiency to the challenges of implementing green building standards in affordable housing. David understood that environmental responsibility and economic accessibility didn't have to be mutually exclusive, a perspective that most people in his field couldn't grasp. He came from a family of overachievers, but had chosen environmental engineering because he wanted to solve real problems, not just accumulate credentials. Our first official date was at a small Mexican restaurant near campus, where David insisted on ordering in his surprisingly good Spanish. He'd spent 2 years after high school volunteering with habitat restoration projects in Costa Rica, an experience that had shaped his approach to both engineering and life. David talked about sustainability, the way Dad talked about construction, as something that could fundamentally improve people's lives if done thoughtfully and ethically. What drew me to David wasn't just his intelligence or his commitment to environmental causes. It was his genuine curiosity about my perspectives and experiences. He asked detailed questions about growing up in a construction family, wanted to understand the complexities of affordable housing development, and never once made me feel like I needed to downplay my knowledge or ambitions to make him comfortable. David came from a very different background than mine. His parents, Dr. Robert Chen and Carol Chen, were established fixtures in Denver's professional community. Dr. Chen was a prominent orthopedic surgeon at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, while Carol was a senior partner at Morrison & Associates, one of Denver's most prestigious law firms, specializing in estate planning and corporate law. They lived in a sprawling modern home in Castle Pines, sent their children to private schools, and moved in circles where success was measured by professional reputation rather than net worth. When David brought me home to meet his parents 6 months into our relationship, I was nervous but optimistic. Dad had always taught me that respect was earned through character and actions, not inherited through circumstances. I dressed carefully, professional but not flashy, and brought Carol a beautiful arrangement of locally grown flowers along with a bottle of wine Dad had recommended. The Chen family home was stunning in its understated elegance. Clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, and carefully curated art that spoke to both sophistication and cultural pride. Carol greeted us at the door wearing a perfectly tailored suit. Despite it being a casual Sunday dinner, her smile warm but appraising. Doctor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chen was finishing a phone call with a colleague, but quickly joined us, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making important first impressions. Dinner conversation flowed smoothly initially. Carol asked thoughtful questions about my studies, seemed impressed by my double major in business and urban planning, and appeared genuinely interested when I described Rodriguez Construction's newest affordable housing project. Dr. Chen shared stories about his own immigrant parents who had moved to Denver from Taiwan in the 1960s, drawing parallels between his family's experience and my father's journey from Mexico. David watched the interaction with obvious pleasure, occasionally catching my eye and smiling when his parents laughed at something I said. Everything felt natural and promising, until Carol asked about my family's business more specifically. Rodriguez Construction has quite a reputation in Denver, she said, refilling my wine glass. Your father must have built something really impressive from such humble beginnings. I imagine the transition from worker to owner was quite challenging. I explained Dad's journey proudly, describing how he'd saved every penny from his construction jobs to buy his first truck, how he'd worked 18-hour days to build his client base, and how he'd never forgotten the families who needed quality housing they could actually afford. Carol nodded approvingly, asking detailed questions about business structure and growth strategies that demonstrated her legal expertise. It's fascinating how some people can create such success through pure determination, she said. Of course, maintaining and protecting that kind of wealth requires different skills entirely. Estate planning, tax optimization, succession strategies. These are areas where many self-made entrepreneurs struggle because they're focused on building rather than preserving. The conversation felt natural, even helpful. Carol wasn't being condescending. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding Dad's business and offering insights from her legal perspective. Dr. Chen added his own observations about the challenges successful immigrants faced in navigating American financial systems, drawing from his experience advising other wealthy families in Denver's medical community. What I didn't recognize at the time was how carefully Carol was gathering information, cataloging details about Rodriguez Construction's structure and assets, while positioning herself as a helpful resource for our family's future planning needs. The warning signs started small, so subtle that I almost missed them entirely. During our second dinner at the Chen house, Carol made an offhand comment about how refreshing it was to meet someone who understood that money couldn't buy class. She was responding to a story I'd told about Dad insisting on learning proper wine etiquette before attending a high-profile charity auction, but something in her tone made me pause. The compliment felt backhanded, as if she was surprised that someone from my background could demonstrate sophistication. When David and I announced our engagement after 2 years of dating, Carol's reaction was enthusiastic but strangely specific. She immediately began discussing wedding venues, suggesting several exclusive locations that she claimed had the right kind of atmosphere for a Chen family celebration. Her recommendations were beautiful, but astronomically expensive, places that would cost more than most people's annual salaries. When I mentioned that Dad would likely prefer something more inclusive where his construction workers and their families would feel comfortable, Carol's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course," she said carefully, "though I think you'll find that mixing different social circles can sometimes create awkward dynamics. Perhaps we could arrange separate celebrations, something intimate for family and close friends, and then a more casual gathering for your father's business associates." David jumped in immediately, saying that our wedding should reflect both our backgrounds and include everyone important to us. But Carol had planted a seed of doubt that began growing in my mind. She wasn't explicitly saying that Dad's friends weren't sophisticated enough for her vision of the wedding, but the implication hung in the air like expensive perfume. The comments became more frequent and increasingly pointed. When I mentioned that Dad was teaching me advanced aspects of construction management, Carol would nod politely, while suggesting that women in business often benefited from more formal education in finance and law. When I talked about spending weekends at construction sites, she'd recommend spa treatments to help me relax from such demanding physical environments. When I wore clothes that were practical rather than fashionable, she'd offer to take me shopping at boutiques where David's previous girlfriends had found their style. Dr. Chen, to his credit, seemed genuinely respectful of my family and background. He asked thoughtful questions about construction techniques, showed interest in Dad's affordable housing initiatives, and never made comments that felt condescending. But he also didn't intervene when Carol made her subtle digs, creating an environment where her disapproval felt validated by his silence. The most telling incident happened during a dinner party Carol hosted for David's medical school classmates and their partners. She introduced me to other guests as David's fiancée, Emily Rodriguez, whose father owns Rodriguez Construction. The introduction itself wasn't problematic, but Carol's tone emphasized construction in a way that clearly differentiated my family's wealth from the inherited or professionally earned money of everyone else in the room. Throughout the evening, Carol made sure to highlight my background in conversations. When someone mentioned vacation homes, she'd note that I probably knew all about construction quality from a unique perspective. When the discussion turned to charitable giving, she'd mentioned that my family focused on affordable housing rather than the arts or education. Every comment was technically positive, but they consistently positioned me as the outsider whose experience was interesting but fundamentally different from everyone else's. David noticed my discomfort during the drive home and asked if something was wrong. When I tried to explain how Carol's comments felt exclusionary, he defended his mother's intentions while acknowledging that she could sometimes be socially awkward. He genuinely believed that Carol was trying to include me in conversations by highlighting my unique background, rather than using that background to subtly exclude me from full acceptance. The pattern became clearer during wedding planning. Carol volunteered to help coordinate details, an offer that seemed generous until she began making unilateral decisions that reflected her vision rather than ours. She booked venue tours at places we'd never discussed, arranged meetings with vendors who specialized in ultra-formal events, and presented David with options that would transform our celebration into something completely different from what we'd envisioned. When I suggested involving Linda in the planning process, Carol's response was immediate and telling. She pointed out that Linda had only been part of our family for a few years and might not understand the traditions and expectations that came with a Chen family wedding. The comment revealed Carol's true perspective. She viewed Linda as an outsider who had married into our family, but she also viewed me as an outsider who was marrying into hers. The difference was that Carol expected me to adapt completely to her family's standards, while making no effort to understand or accommodate mine. She wanted a daughter-in-law who would elevate the Chen family's social status, not someone who would bring her own established identity and values into their world. The real battle lines were drawn when Carol discovered that Dad intended to give me significant control over Rodriguez Construction after our wedding. During a family dinner where Dad proudly announced his succession plans, explaining that I'd been learning every aspect of the business and would eventually take over operations, Carol's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "That's wonderful that Miguel has such confidence in Emily," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I hope you've considered the complexities of mixing marriage and business ownership. David's career in environmental consulting will require significant time and energy, and managing a construction company while supporting a spouse in a demanding field might create unnecessary stress." Dad responded with characteristic directness. "Emily has been working in construction since she was 12 years old. She understands the business better than most people who've been in the industry for decades. This isn't about mixing marriage and business. This is about ensuring that Rodriguez Construction continues serving Denver's working families long after I'm gone." Carol's next comment revealed her true concerns. "Of course. And that's admirable. I just want to make sure Emily understands the legal implications of business ownership, especially regarding personal liability and asset protection. As David's wife, her business decisions could potentially impact his financial security and professional reputation. Perhaps we should discuss establishing some protective structures." The suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, but I recognized it for what it was: an attempt to limit my authority over my own family's business. Carol was positioning herself as a helpful legal advisor while actually trying to create barriers between me and my inheritance. She wanted to ensure that David would have some control over decisions that could affect his future, which really meant that she wanted influence over those decisions. David, caught between his mother's concerns and his loyalty to me, suggested that we might benefit from Carol's legal expertise in structuring our financial arrangements. He genuinely believed his mother was trying to protect both of us, not realizing that her advice would primarily protect the Chen family's interests while limiting my autonomy. The situation escalated when Tyler returned from college for winter break, and Carol arranged a dinner where both families could discuss our upcoming wedding plans. Tyler had graduated with a degree in computer science and was full of enthusiasm about his plans to launch a tech startup focused on neighborhood networking apps. He'd spent months developing his business plan and was actively seeking investors for Connect Local, his platform designed to help local communities share resources and organize events. Tyler's presentation was polished and impressive. He'd clearly inherited Linda's marketing skills and had done extensive research on similar platforms and market opportunities. His financial projections were optimistic but not unrealistic, and his technical approach seemed sound based on my limited understanding of app development. What became problematic was Carol's immediate interest in Tyler's business venture. She began asking detailed questions about his funding needs, timeline for development, and potential returns for early investors. Her legal expertise allowed her to quickly identify the strengths and weaknesses in Tyler's business plan, and she offered to help him refine his investor presentations and legal structure. Carol's attention to Tyler's startup felt excessive compared to her lukewarm interest in my role at Rodriguez Construction. She spent the entire evening discussing app development strategies, market penetration plans, and funding mechanisms, while barely acknowledging the affordable housing project I'd been managing for the past 6 months. The contrast was stark and deliberate. During dessert, Carol made a suggestion that initially sounded supportive, but quickly revealed its underlying agenda. She proposed that our two families could strengthen their bond by making joint investments in each other's business ventures. Rodriguez Construction could provide early funding for Tyler's startup, while the Chen family could offer legal and professional guidance for my business expansion plans. The proposal sounded collaborative, but the specifics revealed Carol's true intentions. She suggested that Rodriguez Construction could invest $200,000 in Connect Local, giving Tyler the capital he needed to launch his platform, while providing our family with potential returns from a successful tech venture. In exchange, Carol would provide ongoing legal services for Rodriguez Construction's expansion, including advice on corporate structure, tax optimization, and estate planning. What made the proposal particularly manipulative was how Carol framed it as an opportunity for me to demonstrate business acumen and family loyalty simultaneously. By investing in Tyler's startup, I could show that I understood modern investment strategies while strengthening the relationships that would be important for my marriage to David. Refusing the investment, on the other hand, would suggest that I was either financially short-sighted or unwilling to support my new family members. Dad listened to Carol's proposal with the poker face he'd developed during decades of business negotiations. But I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He understood exactly what Carol was doing, even if the others didn't recognize her manipulation tactics. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.